In this lecture, we'll look at Pompey. We'll start with his rise to power through his alliance with Sulla, and then look at his shared consulship with Crassus in 70 BC. We'll then turn to his activities against the piracy in the Mediterranean, and then look at his command against Mithridates and the campaigns in the east. And finally, we'll look at his triumphant return to Rome. So Pompey and Crassus, both of them were allies of Sulla against the supporters of Marius and Cinna. Remember that these are the two that met Sulla's army as it was coming back from Asia Minor, and as it prepared to make the march up to Rome in 83-82. As well, both of them were involved in quelling Spartacus' slave revolt. Each of them wanted to take credit for it, and Crassus thought that he was going to be able to take care of Spartacus on his own. As it happened, he needed the assistance of Pompey. There's a lot of competition between the two. They were both very competitive, very ambitious. Each of them had military talents. Crassus had a great deal of wealth. Eventually, Pompey would too. But this is a relationship that was friendly only in the Roman sense of Amicitia as a cooperative relationship where each party got a benefit. But these were not men that hung out together after work. In 70 BC, both of them are elected consul. This is unusual in Pompey's case because he wasn't even a senator. He'd never been a quaestor. Pompey had achieved his status purely through his military actions under Sulla, through the fact that Sulla let him celebrate a triumph after his successes, particularly in North Africa. But Pompey hadn't advanced on the cursus honorum in the way that Crassus had. Pompey was also not old enough, so one of the things that Sulla had done was reinstitute all of the laws governing the cursus honorum. Well, they're immediately ignored in the election in 70 when Pompey is allowed to be elected consul. So that's one of the places where we see Sulla's efforts to regularize the cursus honorum be completely ignored on a case-by-case basis, and certainly in the case of Pompey. The other thing that Pompey and Crassus do is start to revisit Sulla's reforms and return things to the way they'd been pre-Sulla. So one of the key things is restoring the full powers of the tribunate. They eliminate the reforms that Sulla had made that disempowered the tribunate. They recognize, partly because there's such a public outcry, that this is not going to succeed in the long term. That in a kind of dictatorial state, in a temporary way, Sulla was able to pass those reforms, but long term they weren't going to be able to be maintained, and Pompey and Crassus simply removed them. So the tribunate now becomes once again an effective voice of dissent, an effective balance against the power of the Senate. They also restore equestrians to juries. Not fully, but now it's 2/3 equestrians, 1/3 senators. So once again, restoring the voice of the equestrians, the independence of the equestrians from the Senate, which is a transition from Sulla, and shows very clearly the ways in which Crassus and Pompey differed from Sulla in their ideas about governance. So the two of them weren't friends. They didn't particularly get along. Everybody knew this. But in a kind of almost reality television staged event, the two of them get together in Rome and they stage a public reconciliation. The image here is really one of sort of coming up, shaking hands, giving each other a hug, and saying, we're friends now. The idea of this was just to show that even two men with very different ideas, very different ambitions, who were competitive with one another, could get along. It was meant to, again, be a source of stability for Rome, to show that the consulship was returned to its former glory, and that Rome was no longer subject to threats from powerful military commanders like Sulla, and as we'll see, a bit like Pompey. So here you have some images, just so you have a sense of who we're talking about. On the left-hand side, we have Crassus. The right-hand side is Pompey. And one of the interesting things about Crassus in films, in Hollywood films, he's always represented as kind of the fat, rich guy. But in fact, as you can see, I mean, he's really sort of a very thin, weathered soldier. And, you know, if anybody's sort of the fat, rich guy, it's really Pompey. Who's much more filled out. So this gives you some sense of the figures that we're talking about. So one of the major issues that faced Rome, but really all of the communities on the Mediterranean, any community that depended on trade, that depended on the transportation of grain, was piracy. It seems like a kind of silly thing to us in some ways, but of course, piracy is a contemporary issue, and we still have pirates, particularly off the coast of Africa, operating in very sophisticated ways, and people still get kidnapped for ransoms. Well, it was a very serious issue in the 1st century BC. It was affecting, in particular, the transportation of grain, and there was a lot of disruption to the transportation of grain to Italy. Italy, at this point in time, was dependent on importing foreign grain from Sicily and from North Africa. And these ships were being attacked by pirates, and the grain was being diverted. It was also causing problems for travel. So just the movement around Roman holdings, particularly in the eastern Mediterranean. So things had really reached a point. The pirates had something like probably about 1,000 ships and were causing serious harm to the Roman economy at this point. So Rome finally decides we've got to do something. And Pompey's the guy to do something about this. So they offer Pompey this extraordinary command, and it's actually a tribune that makes the proposal, but the Senate passes it. Pompey's offered a 3-year command, so not a 1-year command, but a 3-year command with extraordinary powers that gives him powers throughout the Mediterranean and gives him control over several propraetors and other legates, basically. And this is really an extraordinary instance. And Pompey's whole career is marked by these moments where Roman law is overlooked, in his case, and he's given extraordinary opportunities that are really based on his military powers or his abilities to get legions under his control to be loyal to him. In fact, Pompey ends up, he's got a great plan. He distributes his legates sort of in territories and then launches a simultaneous attack. So there's nowhere for the pirates to flee. And he defeats them in 3 months. So what had been an ongoing war for Rome, and they had been sort of squabbling with the pirates, engaging in limited conflict, now 3 months and Pompey's dealt with the problem. So they give him extraordinary command, he lives up to it. He doesn't kill the pirates. This is sort of interesting. He actually creates a pirate colony. And this pirate colony is far, far away from Rome, in Cilicia, where he settles them. So you can see Rome is off the map in the west. You can just see the little bit of Brundisium peeking out. And Cilicia is way over in Asia Minor, so on the far right-hand side of the map. But it's in Cilicia that he settles these pirates and tells them, you know, he takes their ships away and tells them, settle down, make a life for yourself. And they seem to do so. They become sort of functional citizens and live happily ever after, as it were, in Cilicia. So Mithridates, we've talked a little bit about Mithridates when we're talking about Sulla and Sulla's command over the war against Mithridates, Sulla's successes, but the fact that Sulla actually had to come back to Rome to deal with his reputation in Rome. So Mithridates controlled really a vast amount of territory in Asia Minor, particularly in the west. And at several points through the 1st century, Rome had tried to intervene, had tried to deal with Mithridates, but had never done so successfully. And part of the problem was the reputation of Rome in Asia Minor wasn't that great. It was really seen as an occupier. It was a really non-native force. So in the Western Mediterranean, Rome had a much easier time Romanizing people in its provinces. But in Asia Minor, this process of Romanization really went nowhere. And a lot of even its allied cities didn't particularly enjoy being allies. And they welcomed Mithridates really as a liberator. So there was a lot of complicity with cities that were controlled by Rome with Mithridates. So, Mithridates would come in and they would actually just hand over control of the city. So Asia Minor was a real problem for Rome. In 88, something happens called the Asian Vespers. This is a massive just kill-off, basically. There are about 80,000 Roman citizens and Italians who were killed, who were put to death by Mithridates' command. And it's stunning. I mean, they really did nothing except be Romans. And he just acts in this very hostile way that's really intended to demonstrate to other communities in Asia Minor that he is anti-Roman. He's the voice of the anti-Roman viewpoint, and he will represent them. In 87 through 85, of course, Sulla dealt with Mithridates. He dealt with him pretty successfully, but because of affairs back in Italy, Sulla doesn't sort of actually defeat Mithridates. He negotiates a peace treaty that's relatively favorable, certainly leaves Mithridates with the power to go back to Asia Minor and resume his campaigns. A decade later, in 75, Rome has a new reason to intervene in the affairs in Western Asia Minor. This is when the king of Bithynia, Nicomedes, dies, and Mithridates sees this as an opportunity to invade Bithynia. So Rome decides it's going to intervene, it's going to protect its holding. Bithynia was a Roman allied city, so then it sends legions to Asia Minor once again to deal with Mithridates. The initial consul who is given control of the command against Mithridates in 75 is a guy named Lucullus. And Lucullus actually did a great job. He was chasing Mithridates all over Asia Minor, racking up one success after another, getting cities back under Roman control. The problem was that Mithridates was very good at eluding capture. And Lucullus, instead of just consolidating his holdings, really wanted to get Mithridates. It was a bit like sort of the hunt for Osama. Lucullus was really going after Mithridates, and eventually his troops just had enough. They were exhausted. He was pushing them much harder than they could manage. And finally, in 68, 67, they mutiny. They say, we're done. We're not going to do this anymore. And so Lucullus finds himself then in an impossible position. And once again, Mithridates has escaped and is in a position where he can rebuild power. He'd already started to do that in the years leading up to 67, 68. But at that time, when the troops mutiny, it looks like once again, Roman intervention is going to be unsuccessful, and Mithridates will return to plundering the cities of Western Asia Minor. So in 67, then, we have in Asia Minor, Lucullus's troops have mutinied. They're done. And Rome realizes it needs to do something. It needs to either recall everybody and just hand over Asia Minor to Mithridates, which it's not going to do. It needs the tax revenue from Asia Minor, or actually get somebody over there that can deal with Mithridates. So in 67, it sends 2 fresh commanders over to just basically evaluate the situation, look at the lay of the land, and decide what needs to be done, and report back to the Roman Senate about what needs to be done. What these 2 commanders realize is that Mithridates is once again in a position of substantial power. That for all of Lucullus's initial successes, the fact that he wasn't able to capture Mithridates has meant that Mithridates was able to rebuild his support. He's able to plunder new cities, get more wealth, and rebuild. And once again, Rome finds itself in a difficult position. So in 66, they turn to their great general. He's Pompey the Great for a reason. So Pompey is given command. He had been so successful for Sulla. He had been successful against Spartacus. He was successful against the pirates. Every war that Pompey's given command of, he seems to come out a glowing star. So it's now decided that we're going to send him east to Asia Minor to deal with this rival that has proven to be very elusive. So Pompey is given command in 66, and he's incredibly successful. He goes over to Asia Minor and just moves on through the different communities, gains control for Rome of the territories, and what he does then is he sets up rulers that he knows are going to be favorable to Rome, oftentimes by bribing them. But he recognizes that one of the ways to stave off Mithridates is to ensure that these communities are going to resist him if he comes in. And part of why Mithridates was so successful was simply that these communities wanted to be ruled by Mithridates, not by Rome. They realized they were going to have one master, and they preferred the master of Mithridates rather than Rome. So what Pompey does is counteract that and set up rulers in these communities in Asia Minor that are going to actually be loyal to Rome and make sure that Rome can collect its tax revenue. Finally, in 63, Mithridates dies, and he's not killed by the Romans. It's unclear exactly how he dies. It's by this point in time, his holdings have substantially lessened. It seems that there's a kind of rivalry among his troops, and his troops mutiny, and he's poisoned is one story. It's unclear exactly what happens, but the important thing is in 63, he's finally dead. And this threat that had been really a problem for Rome for several decades now is finally removed. And in 62 then, Pompey comes back from his eastern campaign. So he had dealt with Mithridates, but in the process had also been able to collect a staggering amount of wealth from various eastern cities. He was able to substantially increase his own wealth as well as Rome's wealth. And he was very successful also, not just in regaining control of cities in Asia Minor that had always been allies of Rome, or had been for some time, but he was able to expand Rome's holdings. And the importance of that is it expands the tax base. It means now that Asia Minor is going to be even more important to the Roman treasury. And he reaffirms loyalty. So he makes sure that these cities aren't going to revolt as soon as they can. Remember that Asia Minor is a pretty far distant from Rome. It's hard to manage things. There are certainly local governors there representing Rome, but it's a vast territory and it's difficult to manage. So Pompey does a lot to settle affairs in Asia Minor. He's enormously successful, and for his successes, he becomes enormously wealthy. And here we have a representation. This is a bit imaginary. Pompey was said to have sacked Jerusalem, to have even gone into the temple at Jerusalem. And you see the Jerusalemites on the floor there having been killed, and the Roman troops standing around. So Pompey's return to Rome. When he returns to Italy, he gives a huge sum of money to Rome's treasury. So he doesn't keep it all for himself. He distributes it. He still kept plenty. There was a lot to give away, a lot to keep. But he makes sure that Rome itself is rewarded. He also rewards his soldiers, everybody from the lowest man on the totem pole, all the way up to his officers. His officers got huge bonuses. His foot soldiers got very, very nice bonuses. Part of this is to ensure their future loyalty. He recognized that it might well be important at some later date to call on these veterans in another war, perhaps in a war where he needed a personal army. So one of the things that his Eastern campaigns allow him to do is use some money to ensure the ongoing loyalty of these foot soldiers and even the officers. He himself became massively wealthy, far more wealthy even than Crassus. He was given an elaborate triumph, and he celebrated it in 61. So the Roman Senate recognized his achievements, gives him this elaborate triumph. And it's at this time in the aftermath of his triumph that he does something very interesting. So one of the things we talked about when we talked about triumphs was that generals would often begin building projects, usually temples. So Pompey begins to build a stone theater. And this is the first stone theater in Rome. There hadn't been one prior to this. And one of the reasons why was that theaters were seen as appealing to the masses, as popularist. So there were theaters, but they were always wooden, and productions would be staged, oftentimes for a set period of time. There would be a theatrical festival. These festivals would be sponsored by usually members of the senatorial aristocracy, so it was a way of cultivating popular support in the same way that subsidizing the grain dole was. But there was a real anxiety about having a permanent stone theater in Rome, that it seemed like, especially if it was built by an individual, that this was just a way of ensuring the ongoing popularity and favor with the masses. So Pompey disbanded his army when he returned to Italy. And this was a little bit surprising to some people, that when he landed in Brundisium, he disbanded the army. It shows, among other things, that he had no desire for monarchy or to rule. He wasn't really interested in governance. He never was. He was a soldier. He certainly wanted to be rewarded. He had a big ego. He was going to make sure that he celebrated a triumph, but he wasn't interested in the sort of finer points of governance in the way that somebody like Sulla actually was. All that Pompey asked for was that the Senate ratify the arrangements that he had made in the East, and he had gone to some effort to make sure that these Eastern communities in Asia Minor would be loyal to Rome. He wanted to make sure that those arrangements were ratified by the Senate. So here we have a reconstruction of the theater of Pompey. And as I said, it was really unusual. I mean, it was novel to be permitted even to build a stone theater. Pompey was able to do this because he was capitalizing on his enormous popularity and the fact that the Senate did not dare resist. So he builds this beautiful stone theater, but what he does to sort of make sure that nobody accuses him of openly courting the masses is he tops it with a temple. And so in the top right-hand corner of the slide, you can see there's a temple that's actually dedicated to Venus Genitrix, Venus the Mother. And so it's a really unusual construction in that it's a theater with a temple, a theater cum temple, you could call it. And it had lots of meeting space to hold public business as well. And this building will come back into play in our narrative of Roman history in a couple of lectures down the line. But so the important thing here, though, is that just like other military generals built temples, Pompey does too. It's just that his temple happened to be sitting on top of a theater. So it was a way that he was able to kind of have his cake and eat it too. And it was a striking building in this regard. And in one of the public spaces, there was a statue, a giant statue of Pompey holding, and you can see his hand sort of sticking out, originally holding a globe. And what this was, he was surrounded originally by the 14 nations that he conquered. And it was, again, meant to symbolize his victory. So this theater then becomes a kind of victory monument. It's an unusual victory monument. It's crowned with a temple. It's a victory monument to Pompey, with a visible statue of him. So rather than an arch or a column, here we have a theater being built.